Greetings and welcome to today's program. My name is Kristen Kolish. I'm an advisor and partner with the Mahoney Group of Raymond James, and I'm very excited to be speaking to you today about the topic of financial foundations. Now, while the tone of the conversation is geared towards those who are earlier in their career, this can also be a great refresher on just making sound financial decisions. And I'm so excited about this topic because ultimately, the earlier you are in your working years, the more time you have really to put your human capital and your financial capital to work. I'll just give you a bit of background. I actually initially met the advisors at the Mahoney Group when I was an intern with them in high school. Now, my education and career took me in a couple different directions, but ultimately, I've really established my career as a financial advisor with a team that I met nearly 30 years ago. And I share that because you never know what interactions or what relationships you have that are going to blossom into something that's really fantastic and great. I'm eternally grateful for the career that I have and the relationships that I have. And I would just encourage you to be open-minded about learning about finance, but also open-minded as you progress through your career. You really just want to be a sponge and take in everything that you possibly can. I'm going to be taking myself off video as I walk you through these slides, and then I'll come back at the end to make some closing remarks. So let's dig in here. What is the secret to being successful financially? Now, you may be waiting for me to give you this golden nugget or ticket about how to really do a great job. It's honestly not as exciting as you might think, like most things. You need to be a great saver. You can't be a good investor until you have something to invest. So you got to start with saving. And saving is ultimately a battle between your current self and your future self. It's the idea of delaying gratification. By stocking away money regularly, you can avoid a lifetime of financial anxiety and stress and enjoy decades of investment compounding. I'm going to talk more about what that is. And ultimately, buy yourselves the financial freedom to pursue your passion. Ultimately, financial flexibility is something that you earn. And you earn it by small incremental decisions that you make each and every day. There is a very relevant parallel between financial health and physical health. From a physical perspective, you want to eat a balanced diet. You want to make sure that you're exercising regularly. And consistency is more important than having a 3-hour workout or starving yourself for 2 days. There's a parallel in the financial world. Making consistent habits, saving early, investing automatically. Those are the habits that are going to compound and multiply to reward yourself in the future. And that could be both encouraging and discouraging. It's encouraging because you don't have to have this phenomenally huge decision to make sure that you are on a solid financial path. It's actually small decisions that are bite-sized and manageable. I like to encourage investors to just make their next right decision. Let's be honest, making financial decisions can feel overwhelming, particularly if you haven't been trained or educated in this regard. So just think about what is your next right decision. And that's why I've structured this program in 5 steps to thrive as you enter the workforce, or really 5 steps to thrive as you look to improve your financial foundation. And each one of these steps, you may find yourself in a different spot. So my goal for today's remarks is for you to walk away with 1 or 2 actionable ideas that you're going to execute on in the next couple of months. And then you can come back and take another 2 actionable ideas. Everything is modular here. We're going to start by assessing your current financial situation. We're going to talk about setting financial goals, manifesting that through a plan, a budgeting plan, and a savings plan. We're going to talk about how debt and credit building and risk management come into play. And then we're going to end with, honestly, where most people start, which is the investing piece. I find that especially young folks are very quick to jump into, okay, well, what investment should I buy with the dollars that I've saved? Well, before you can decide what to buy, we need to think about investments as a tool. You don't know what tool to use unless you know what your project is, what the goals are that you're rooting for. So that's where the initial steps here come into play. I love this saying, we are looking for progress, not perfection. It's applicable in so many aspects of life. So let's start by assessing your current financial situation. The slide on this page gives 4 paradigms. We've got spending, saving, borrowing, and planning. And this can be considered a checklist of sorts. From a spending perspective, your goal from day one is to spend less than you make. Live not just within your means, below your means, because that allows you to save. It's super important. And in some ways, this goes without saying, but for a lot of Americans, they don't necessarily do this. Make sure that you're paying your bills on time. And ideally, make sure you're paying your bills in full. A lot of people lean on credit cards to meet their spending desires currently. We'll talk about that. From a saving perspective, you want to make sure that you have an operating cash cushion, liquid savings for those surprises that cost dollars so that you don't have to go into debt. So you need that reserve. And you also want to save so that you're confident you're going to be able to meet your long-term goals. Borrowers are those that are taking on debt. You're borrowing money for a specific purpose. Debt in and of itself is not bad. In fact, it's allowed my family and I to purchase a home. It could allow you to purchase a car. You want your debt to be manageable, to be fiscally responsible, so not the cost of financing is not egregious. And you also want to be aware of what debt does to your credit score. We'll talk about that as well. And ultimately, we're looking to have a plan. We're going to plan for our goals, but we're also going to plan for those rainy days, those risks that we may be faced. And that's where insurance can come into play. I mentioned a couple times already how excited I get about speaking to those who are young and early in their investing and saving career. And that's because the true gift an investor should be capitalizing on is time. Time in the market ultimately is more impactful than timing the market. That's a phrase that you'll hear. Let's compare an example. We've got Jane, who in her early 20s was guided to start saving automatically. And she began with $12,500 a year. Now, the dollar amount is not as important as the relative success of Jane to her colleague, John, who's in his mid-30s, before someone kind of taps him on the shoulder and says, you got to get going, you got to start saving. Then we've got Susan, who is very late to the game at the age of 45, and Chris, who was only, he's hoping to retire at 65. He starts 10 years before, and that seems like an impossible task. So let's look at these outcomes. Jane, over her 40-year career, contributed $500,000, 500,000. And this is assuming an average annual rate of return of 6%. By the time she retired, her 500,000 was 4 times that $2 million. So that's interesting in and of itself. What's more eye-opening is to compare her experience to John. John waited 10 years. He contributed 375,000. So he did a pretty good job, right? He saved some money. Well, his balance by the time he got to retirement was half of what Jane was because of the time delay for him to get started. And the problem exasperates the longer you wait. Susan at age 45 has only accumulated what Jane put in. And Chris is certainly not have enough to retire here. So the earlier you start, the better you're going to put yourself in this position. And I'll tell you from personal experience, I started at my first job with the 401k. I saved to maximize the match. And I look back on it and I wish I would have challenged myself to save more. In the early years, it felt like I was saving and the money wasn't growing. But before you know it, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years, that really gives the opportunity for the markets to play out. And yes, markets are volatile, but you want volatility when you're just starting out. We're going to talk about why in a moment. You're probably thinking I'm crazy right now. So wrapping up on assessing your situation, you want to know two things. You want to know what is your net worth and what is your cash flow. So net worth, simply stated, is the differences between what you own and what you owe. Assets minus liabilities. And starting out, particularly if you have student loan debt, you could have a negative net worth. This is a number we want to grow over time. Cash flow is comparing your income sources, your salary, bonus, to the expenses, to what you have coming out. There are parallels here to, for instance, your employer, businesses, to the stocks we're going to talk about in the last section. As a shareholder, you are owning a piece of a business. And what do businesses want to do? They want to make sound financial decisions. They can't be spending more money today than they're making because they don't have the resources to expand their business in the future. So I would encourage you to think about your personal financial situation akin to running a business. You are the CEO of your financial future. Yes, you don't have to be the CFO. You don't need to know all the details. You can tap resources and advisors to help you with that. But you need to have the discipline and the vision to execute on the financial plan that others can help you build. Admittedly, at this stage, liabilities and expenses, as I mentioned, could be higher than assets and income, but we want to expand that over time. The next step here is to set financial goals. And right now, the goals may not be crystallizing in your head. Maybe you're early on and the idea of retirement, that's not even a relevant concept to you right now, right? You want to make some financial strides, you want to make progress, you want to have flexibility. But I would encourage you to think about this quote: a goal without a plan is simply a wish. So let's be specific about what you're rooting for. What are you saving for? When do you want to buy it, or when do you need the capital for it? And how much will it cost at that time? These are three questions that, as you go through your career, as you evolve as an investor, you want to continually ask yourselves. And you're going to have goals that have different time horizons. You've got short-term goals, intermediate-term goals, and long-term goals. And guess what? By articulating and identifying your goals, you're actually going to make the investing decision process easier, because your time horizon on when you need the capital for meeting these goals is going to inform how you invest. So that's why setting the stage and doing this upfront work is so important. So on the screen here, we've got some examples. Maybe your initial goal is, I just need to cover my monthly living expenses. Maybe you've got some debt you want to pay down. Perhaps you're just starting out, you need to build your cash reserve. Or maybe you're further along and you want to save for a down payment. You're looking to fund education costs. Or, you know what, you're not, what's the saying? You're not living to work, you're working to live. You want to budget for travel and experiences. That's fine. Just identify the goal, put a number to it, and a time horizon. You want to just save for your future. You're not exactly sure what that's going to look like. You want to develop some guidance on an investment strategy. The third step is to create a budget and savings plan. And Warren Buffett has some great advice here. He says, do not save what is left after spending, but spend what is left after saving. That is so meaningful. Now, I'm going to take a step back. This might be basic to some, but when you first get a paycheck, and I'm dating myself here, you're not actually likely getting a pay stub or a check. It's a direct deposit, and it's a link to an intranet where you can access your pay stub detail. You want to understand what it says. You want to know where each dollar goes. It's very important. And how many times do I hear people say, I thought I was making $50,000 a year, but I have so many things coming out. Of course, yes. So it's not your salary, it's your take-home pay that counts. So once you start have earnings, you're going to pay a federal income tax, and that's a progressive tax, which means you pay a higher interest rate, a higher tax rate, I should say, the more income you earn. You've got Social Security tax, and that's deducted as a flat percentage of 6.2% up to a certain amount of income. Now, you may not realize this, but your employer also contributes that dollar amount. And that's ultimately to have capital. So at some point in the future, there is a Social Security benefit. We're not sure what that might look like, but it's for savings for the future. Medicare taxed is a flat percentage, 1.45%, and there could be other taxes and deductions as well. From a benefits perspective, you may be offered in a medical plan. Well, the premium for those medical programs can be deductions from your income. If you make a contribution to a 401k on a pre-tax basis, we'll talk about this, that could also be a deduction from your income, ultimately reducing your take-home pay. State and local taxes. Now, this varies by region. If you live in a state like Texas or Florida, there is no state income tax. There's other taxes. If you live in a state like I live in New York State, it could be well over 8.5%. So you want to know what your take-home pay is. Then you want to give yourself some guidelines. I've spoken to very successful people who said, you know what, as soon as I got a paycheck, I saved 15%. And it just was a non-negotiable. And I will tell you, that might be a little deflating for some, particularly if you have debt. Paying down debt, I would put in the category of saving. So give yourself a little encouragement there. But you want to think about where your dollars go. So you want to identify what are your fixed expenses, and that's housing, utilities, food, transportation, and give it a cap. You know, maybe I would say if you're further along, maybe 50%. Here I'm giving 50 to 60%, depending on what your income level is. Depending on where you live, it can be very expensive to cover housing. I know lots of people, myself included, at some point after I actually was an adult with a full-time job, I actually lived back with my parents for a little bit of time to bank some money. Saving early is so important. But you do have to live, and you want to give yourself the flexibility to do that by giving a budget to those wants, to those non-discretionary expenses. Maybe that's going out for dinner or going on trips, purchasing clothes, things that make you happy. But the 10 to 20% savings is the area that really, by paying yourself first, that's going to compound. I like to use the phrase, you want to give every dollar a job. And I will tell you, I hate the word budget. I hate the word budget because as soon as I say it, I want to tense up, and you might feel the same way. Budgeting sounds restrictive, but let's kind of flip this concept on its head. Think about a budget as intentional spending. You are being intentional about where your income is going. You want to know where your money goes. It's very common for advisors to give the example of someone who has a Starbucks habit. You know, they go to Starbucks every day, and Starbucks gets a bad rap, honestly. You know, you're 5, 6, I've even seen upwards of $8 on a latte. That times 5 times 52 weeks a year, the opportunity cost of actually investing those dollars, that's a very expensive habit. And that's true. But if your break during the day to go to Starbucks is the mental health break you needed to just disconnect and regroup to make yourself successful for the rest of the day, that could be the best $5 you've ever spent. It comes down to everyone is a unique individual, and you getting satisfaction out of where you're spending your dollars is something only you can decide. But let's be real, there's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There is a limited income source. So you need to make trade-offs. And that's like so many things in life. If you're spending dollars here, you're not spending dollars there, which is why you want to put it to paper. I include here a visual. This is actually, if you open Excel, Microsoft Excel, and set a new template and ask for an annual budget template, you could set that up there. There's lots of apps that also have dollar tracking, spending tracking as well. But you want to know, where does your money go? And ultimately, you want to pay yourself first. So I think about this as a hierarchy, meaning when I think about where your next dollar should go, it depends where your last dollar went. So let's start with the top of the hierarchy here, which is emergency fund. You need to have 3 to 6 months living expenses in something that's liquid, so that if you have a surprise expense, that you're not tapping your assets, at an inopportune time, and you're also not going into debt for expenses that should be funded elsewhere. Then you want to look at what your employer offers you. What types of plans do they offer through their benefits program? Do you have a 401k? Do you have a 403b? Do you have a health savings account that is associated with a medical plan? You want to understand what free money can you get from your employer, and you need to take advantage of every dollar. A common match formula, if you save 6% in a 401k, maybe the employer will match 50%. You save 6, they give you 3. That's a 50% return on your money before you even invest. That is so important. Health savings account. The HSA is an investment vehicle that is underappreciated in terms of its magnitude because it has the optionality of being triple tax exempt. The money you put in is not taxed. If you invest it, and this is where there's an education needed for a lot of workers and employers, you can actually invest HSA dollars that can grow tax advantaged. And if you take it out for a qualifying medical expense, even if it's years down the road for an expense today, then you're taking that distribution out and it's not taxed. So you got to take advantage of the match. I know I kind of belabored a point there. Then you want to look at your debts. And you want to say, well, what are my outstanding debts and what is the interest rate I'm paying on each? And if the interest rate is 75%, well, then maybe you don't want to save in the match. But in most instances, you want to take advantage of that employer match. Then you're going to look at paying down expensive debt. And there's 2 ways to go. You could look at paying the highest cost first or the smallest outstanding balance first to just feel yourself getting some positive momentum. Then you want to save for any intermediate term goals that you have. You're going to increase your savings again in your 401k or 403b or HSA. There are IRS dollar limits there. And then look at additional taxable savings. Another thing to be aware of, if maybe you're still a student, but you work in the summers or part-time, maybe you don't have access to an employer plan. Well, if you have earned wages, and you're within certain income limits, which if you're a student, you likely are if you're only working part-time, you can open a Roth IRA. And that is a very impactful account because while you're putting money in on a post-tax basis, that money grows tax exempt and you can invest it. So I often see and guide clients that if you've got, if a high school student or if you're a college student and you had money that you saved in a summer job, you might want to think about making a Roth IRA contribution. It's something that you can do around tax filing deadline time. So even for year 2025, you might have until April of 2026 to make that contribution. Don't wait too long, but you do have some flexibility there. So now let's think about step 4, which is debt management, credit building, and risk management. Every debt paid is an automatic pay raise. You pay a debt down, you're eliminating a future expense of yours, and that is a beautiful thing. Mentioned before, not all debt is awful, but some debt is. Credit card debt is awful. Why? Because you're usually using it for, I shouldn't say this, you could be using it for an expense that is a want and not a need, but sometimes that's not the case. But the thing with credit card debt is that you're receiving, if you only make the minimum payment each month, it is going to take you a ridiculous amount of time to pay it off, and the interest expense is going to be egregious. We've got an example here where someone used a credit card and bought a TV for $1,000. If they paid $100 a month, they would have paid 9.6% in interest, in other words, $96. And that would have taken, about 10 months to pay it off. However, if they only paid the minimum balance, it literally, their $1,000 TV was 50% more expensive. And you don't realize it because you're just paying it over time. It can be detrimental to your wealth. So you want to understand if you have a balance, what the interest rate is, and really look to pay that down. Personally, I will tell you, senior year in college, I ran a very, well, relative to, I guess, what it could have been a small credit card balance. It was absolutely suffocating, and I promised myself I would never do it again. So really, that's something to be aware of and to avoid at all costs. Now let's compare this to student loan debt. Well, theoretically, if you're a student loan, you're investing in your education, you're investing in yourself. That's a good way to go. But you also want to be aware of what are the interest rates. And now student loan debt payments are now a thing. You got to come back and pay your outstanding debts and understand what you may have the potential to take on to earn more income with a diploma, and that's important, but think about what you're using that diploma for. You might be surprised, I was surprised, that nearly 25% of those who have outstanding student loan debt are actually over the age of 50. So that becomes a struggle. It could have been their student loan debt or student loan debt that they're taking on for their children. Well, at the age of 50, you're getting close to being a pre-retiree, and now you're balancing this struggle between paying down student loan debt and saving for retirement, and that can be very difficult. A credit score informs the interest rate you're going to pay on debt. So what informs your credit score? Well, it depends on how long of a credit history you have. So, for instance, someone who's 10 years old who does not have a financial livelihood of their own may not have any credit history. So having no credit history is not going to give you a good score. You have to prove to borrowers that you are a good credit, that you're going to pay your debts off. So for instance, taking out a credit card and paying it off each month could be a good way to start doing that. Adding new credit, having amounts owed, having a payment history is what is going to inform the FICO score. And the FICO score is really your credit score. Why is a credit score important? Well, look at the right-hand side of this page. So the highest credit score you can get is 800. What I show here is a home loan, a mortgage for a new home, as well as a 5-year car loan. The exceptional borrowers with a very high credit rate get a mortgage rate, and this is what's important here is not the current rate because it's a snapshot in time, but the relative rate of 6%. Well, someone who had a 640 credit rate, that's over 1% more expensive. And on a purchase of a home, that's real dollars. For a 5-year car loan, exceptional buyers might get an interest cost of 5.6%. And again, this is just for relevant. This is not necessarily current rates. A very, very risky borrower, their interest rate could be nearly 3 times that. So you want to know your credit score, and then you want to protect it. Insurance. So this is something that may require a bit of an education because when you were younger, maybe your parents took care of this for you or your guardians. And it's a question, do I need insurance? Well, it depends what risk you're insuring against. You do want to be prepared, but is it better to have it and not need it or need it and not have it? Well, it depends. So there are certain risks that you might be able to afford. For instance, when I go to the eye doctor, I get glasses, I can pay insurance for the glasses. You know what? I'm not going to pay the insurance because if I broke my glasses, it's not a huge out-of-pocket expense and I don't want to pay those premiums. Lost jewelry, well, that's a personal preference. If you have a very, very, very old car, what is the insurable interest there? Pet insurance, that's a personal decision, but it's an area that I'm starting to see people become more and more interested in. You want to make sure with insurance that you understand exactly the coverage you're getting, because I think a lot of people assume, okay, if I get pet insurance, I pay the premium, they're going to cover the cost for my pet's medical expenses. That may not be the case. It could be just for catastrophic or for big or deductibles or other aspects of that. Now, the risks that you can't afford not to insure might be medical. So depending on your age, you could still be covered on your on your family plan up until the age of 26. But you should be aware that if you're covered on your family's plan, you may not be able to make a contribution to an HSA with the high deductible plan. So I'm not suggesting that you need to know the details of every plan. You need to know once you're in the workforce, what is available to you through your employer and identify what is your insurable interest. For instance, if you take out a mortgage on your home, God forbid something happens to you, maybe you're married and your spouse is going to be left, maybe they're not working, they're going to be left with covering the mortgage. Or once you start to have children and growing family, God forbid something happens to your ability to earn an income. You're on disability. Well, how is your family going to function? So disability income insurance, life insurance, property insurance, medical insurance, those are things that as you get older, and as your life becomes a little bit more complicated, you want to make sure that you're properly insured. Ultimately, you need to identify if you didn't have an income or if you weren't around, what would happen? What are the bad things and how can you protect against that risk? It would be great to have insurance and not need it. Of course, we're not rooting for using it, but God forbid you need it and you didn't have it for one of these risks that are very expensive versus some of these risks that you could afford to bear the risk of, that could be life-changing and not necessarily in a good way. Now I'm jumping to step 5, which in many ways is where people want to start, as I mentioned before, investing for your future. Another Warren Buffett oldie but goodie. Someone's sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago, putting time on your side as an investor. Now, admittedly, I could spend an hour just talking about this topic. I promise I won't. I'm going to give you the highlights and give you some action steps. But before I do, let me set the stage. If we were in person, I'd ask you to raise your hand. Would you rather double a penny every day for 31 days or receive $5 million? Well, drum roll, please. You would be better off with a penny every day doubled for 31 days than receiving $5 million. And while this is an extreme example, it demonstrates the power of compounding interest. Compounding interest means it's not just your penny that's going to earn a rate of return, but as you proceed over time, it's the earnings on your initial savings that's going to earn. And those earnings are going to earn. And that has the potential to be exponential. This, again, is just for illustrative purposes. I wouldn't expect to double your money every day or even double your money in this time period. However, if you're thinking about goals and you don't necessarily have something specific that you're saving for, other than I just want to, I want to make progress, I want to save for my future, you could say, okay, well, I want to double my money over a certain period of time. And I'm going to introduce this very specific mathematical rule, and bear with me for a second. It's called the rule of 72. And this is where you take the number 72 and you divide it by your rate of return. And that rate of return, 72 divided by your rate of return, would tell you how long it's going to take to double your money. So if you're going to earn an annual rate of return of 10%, again, the markets don't provide that each and every year, but let's just use this for an example. It would take you 7 years to double your initial investment. Ultimately, you want to put time on your side. You see the quote here that compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, because they save and they invest. He who does not pays it, perhaps because they go into debt. And that the famous Albert Einstein said that a long time ago. As an investor, you want to identify what are the things you get to control and what are the things you don't, because being an investor can be an emotional roller coaster. If you are following the markets and you see that you either bought an index or you bought an individual stock, and you read a news story and it's up 3% one day, it's down 5% another, and you are going along for the ride, that can be emotionally draining and not necessarily productive, because ultimately market returns are out of our control. Over time, we can position ourselves to take advantage of it, but day-to-day basis, completely out of our control, as our policies, taxes, things like that. We do get to control how much we save and we spend, which is why I spent so much time on that in the beginning of this program. And we also get to control how much risk we take. And ultimately, that's going to be the driver of your return over time. What I mean by that is how much of your assets are going to be positioned in stocks for growth versus maybe cash for stability and capital preservation. And you have some control over your earnings, your employment, how long you work, to the extent that you take care of yourself, maybe longevity. But my takeaway point here is that we don't control the market. We need to understand it, however. And from an Investing 101 perspective, I'm just going to describe stocks, bonds, and cash. Stock represents ownership in a company. So whether you have your own business and you are a sole proprietor, you own a stock. It's your private stock. It's your private company. Or if you buy public shares of a company on the exchange, so you buy Apple, Nvidia, PepsiCo, and I'm just using these as examples. If you buy shares, you're owners in a company. You would have voting rights. You could vote proxies. Stocks, because they give you you're buying stock today because you want to benefit from the company's future earnings potential. And it's historically had higher returns than bonds and cash. But it takes on more risks, which means and that's generally speaking, a greater the possibility of return, the greater possibility of risk. Bonds is where you are lending money to a borrower. For instance, if you buy a US Treasury bond, you are lending money to the US government, and they are promising to pay you back what you borrowed plus an interest rate. So it's income generation. Generally lower risk than stocks, but it can be influenced by different things such as interest rates. If interest rates go up, bond prices go down, and vice versa. But over time, high quality bonds have historically been a good diversifying asset class versus stock risk and return. And cash, why do you put money in cash or equivalents? The objective is to not lose money. You expect a low rate of return, but it's also low risk. It may or may not keep pace with inflation. One note on cash. You should be aware of what your low risk assets are paying you from a rate of return, because not all cash is created equal. Sometimes you can have money sitting in a bank deposit that's paying you next to nothing. In certain interest rates environment, and I go back to 2020 time period, about 5 years ago, interest rates were so low, your cash investments, regardless of where they were zero. But if you had money in today in a money market or a CD, you could get a rate of return. So be conscious of what your cash is paying you. Asset allocation, I mentioned it before, is simply the mix of assets you have between risk-seeking, return-seeking assets that could be risky, and risk-mitigating assets. And as you see here, studies have shown that nearly 90% of your return over a business cycle is associated to your asset allocation, that mix. Security selection, market timing, they have an impact, but look here, it's such a small impact compared to your asset allocation, which is why, as advisors, my team and I spend so much time talking to clients about what is the appropriate asset allocation. And you may recall initially I said, identifying a goal, short, intermediate term, and long, will help you in the investing decision process. Why is that? Well, if you needed money in the next 6 to 12 months to buy a car, I'd tell you, do not put it in stock. Too much risk. However, if you were investing for retirement or for a child's education in 20 years or 15 years, yes, put a portion of it in stock. And the portion could be determined by your individual risk tolerance. And goals that you have in the short, intermediate term, maybe 5 to 7 years, maybe you're building a down payment, what have you. Maybe it's a mix of stocks and bonds. But articulating and identifying your goals will help the investment making decision process easier. Another point on the asset allocation, once you determine what your target should be, you want to make sure it's being rebalanced. It's a great way to control your risk. And rebalancing is simply making sure that you stay at your asset allocation. So if you're following the markets, it's generally been strong over the last 2 years. If your asset allocation target, let's say, was 70% stock, maybe you've grown to 75% stock. By rebalancing, you're trimming from what's done well and adding to what has not done well. And let's just talk about that for a second. I'll get back to the sub-asset class slide. What that means is when markets are doing well, our inclination is we want to buy more, right? Because we feel good that our value is going up. But think about a stock investor. You are a consumer of an investment. Okay, let's forget about stocks for a second. If you are a consumer of a good or service, when do you want to consume something? When do you want to buy something? You want to be thrifty. You want to buy when things are on sale. You don't want to buy a winter coat in October. You want to buy a winter coat on the sale rack for clearance, 50% off in April. Or, the December to remember advertising messaging on cars. They need to meet their quota, so maybe you'll get a better deal at the end of the year. Buying at a low price. Buy low, sell high. except our emotions make it more comfortable for us to do the opposite because we are greedy when things are doing well and we want to buy more of what's done well. And when things do poorly, we're fearful and maybe we want to stop the bleeding and stop the losses. Another great Warren Buffett quote, be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. It's a bit of a contrarian point of view. But ultimately, this means that when it is the hardest to be an investor, when you've seen your assets decline, as long as you don't need the money in the interim and you have a plan and you're diversified, that could be the best time to be an investor. It could be a great opportunity to make money and a great opportunity to actually add to your investing, which is why automating the processes is so important. So whether it's through a retirement plan at work or whether it's through automatic investing in a brokerage account, making sure that you are making and establishing sound financial habits by investing periodically. There's a fancy word for it. It's called dollar cost averaging. All that means is automatic periodic investments. Put time on your side, because if I were to proactively go to you, let's say in really in March of this year, in April of 2020, think about other market sell-offs and say, do you want to take this money and spend it, or do you want to invest it? Well, when the markets are choppy, you might choose the former because you're fearful that the prices are going to go down. But automating the investment process, I cannot overstate this enough, is so important. Now, on a risk spectrum, I talked about stocks being more risky and more potential for return than bonds and cash. Well, here it's I flip it, but it's cash, then certificates of deposits, treasury bonds, and there's different types of stocks. You've got US stocks, small cap stocks, international stocks that in a silo might seem more aggressive, but if you put an allocation of a number of these together, it could actually be quite beneficial from a diversification perspective. So I'm going to wrap up with some next steps. I started by saying I'd like you to identify one or two action steps. A journey of 1,000 miles begins. Exactly that, just one single step. I can appreciate developing and executing a financial plan can feel overwhelming. There are resources available to you. Please reach out if you have questions, if we can be of assistance. But ultimately, pick one or two things that might be your next right financial decision and execute on it. It's so important. And if you're not sure, I'm wrapping up with a list of ideas here. Here's a checklist for a strong financial future. From a liquidity perspective, it's creating an emergency fund and identifying a monthly budget. Spend a month, track your expenses if you're not sure what your budget looks like. From a debt management perspective, you need to identify your outstanding debts and interest rates. You can look up your credit score at annualcreditreport.com and determine payoff strategies. From a risk management perspective, you want to consider what insurance needs you have and what options are available to you, either through your parents' plan or through your own. If you're over the age of 18, I would strongly encourage you to name a healthcare proxy. What does that mean? Well, because of HIPAA, which is the healthcare privacy laws, you might, if you're an adult, your parents may not necessarily, or they would not be able to get information if, God forbid, something happens to you from a medical perspective. So you want to make sure that you're protecting against that risk and naming certain individuals in your life that you trust, that you would want to be part of a process or access to information if something happens to you. So naming a healthcare proxy. That's something that you could look at online. Your doctors may also have healthcare proxy forms, but that's an important takeaway. From a saving and investing standpoint, understanding if you're in the workforce, what are your savings options through your employer? Enroll when eligible, look to maximize your employer contribution at a minimum. You want to pay yourself first by automating savings. As you continue and progress in your career, I hope that you get pay raises. Well, if you were used to living off a certain income level for quite a long time, why don't you bank 30 to 50% of the potential pay raise and save it? I mentioned before that a Roth IRA with W-2 earnings could be a great way to start saving. For now and always, I'd encourage you to be a lifetime learner, ask questions, network. You never know where life will take you. Appreciate opportunities and experiences and be inquisitive. I'm so thankful that you spent the time to digest and absorb this very informative and important content. If there's anything you have questions on, you can certainly feel free to reach out. Be well and take care.